Hello and welcome to The Nation. I'm Peter Donaldson, filling in for David Spears this evening. Well, it was only a matter of days ago that I sat in this same studio for Australian Agenda, including with two of the panellists that are on tonight. But a lot changes in Australian politics in a very short space of time. We have a fresh diplomatic incident with the fallout with China. That, of course, follows the ongoing saga in relation to Indonesia. Schools are now back in the news with a backflip on an election promise from Christopher Pyne. The polls are heading downwards. And, of course, we're now looking potentially, not definitely, but potentially at renationalising the airlines. This is what happens, I suppose, when the adults are in charge. We'll be asking Kelly O'Dwyer, the Liberal member for Higgins, about this very issue shortly, as well as from the Transport Workers Union, Tony Sheldon, free marketeer for the Institute of Public Affairs, who I suspect this evening may break ranks with Kelly O'Dwyer and the Liberal Party a little bit on some of the issues we're discussing. Tim Wilson, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
And the member for Wakefield, Nick Champion, thanks for your company.
Cheers.
Kelly O'Dwyer, let me start with you. As a well-known free marketeer within the Liberal Party, how do you feel about the idea of potentially re-owning Qantas from a government perspective?
Well, I'm not sure we're at that point in the discussion. I think
it's
everyone's
been mooted, though.
I'm not exactly sure who by, but there's been a lot of hysterical discussion around Qantas, and I can understand that people are very emotional when we talk about Qantas as a national airline. But I think the first thing we need to do is to get all the facts on the table, to understand the current position, and to, as Joe Hockey has rightly said, look at whether or not the legislation needs to be reviewed with ownership limits, and whether or not that would make a difference to letting Qantas be more competitive in a very globally competitive environment.
But Alan Joyce has made clear, as the CEO of Qantas, that he doesn't think that the option that should be on the table is this idea of changing the foreign ownership restrictions, and that only leaves, from his perspective at least, the possibility of taxpayers' funds going into the airline. Is that something that should be on the table in your view?
Well, I think what Joe has suggested is entirely what we should be looking at in terms of Qantas and the foreign ownership limits. I think if we're talking about this issue, we need to look at all of the issues that mean that Qantas is less competitive. I think it also means we actually have to look at some of the industrial relations issues, which also go to the core of whether or not Qantas is competitive relative to airlines around the world. So there are lots of issues that I think need to be brought to the table. I think we need to do that in a fairly dispassionate way, and I think we need to be able to analyse it where everybody gets to put their perspective, and I'm sure that that's what will happen.
Tim Wilson, normally I'd go to somebody from the other side of politics to see where they sit, but let me go to you on this particular issue. What might you take issue with in some of the discussion around options in regards to Qantas?
Well, my issue would, of course, be that if Qantas seeks to get subsidies from the government and take money from taxpayers to buttress their profits and their position in the marketplace, that would be a disgraceful outcome. But I don't think that the coalition is going to end up there. I think Joe Hockey's position today was 100% right, putting out there the idea of removing the investment restrictions on Qantas, basically requiring them to have 51% local ownership.
Alan Joyce doesn't think that's the issue.
He may not think that's the issue. I don't think he actually said it was an issue. He said he didn't think it was the solution. But Qantas has wanted these restrictions removed in the past. They're anachronistic. They're the sort of thing that should have been left and gone a long time ago. Arguably, they should have been done perhaps during the previous government or even before that in the Howard government. Those are the sorts of things the government should be focusing on, freeing up the sector so it can be internationally competitive, not seeking subsidies, because in the end, we know what happens. That just means that the car industry suddenly has wings and the taxpayers will foot the bill every step of the way.
Nick Champion, you are an advocate for subsidising the car industry, so presumably you would think that subsidising the airline industry, or Qantas in particular, if necessary, is an okay idea?
Well, look, I think we might want to put that one to one side for the moment, whether or not we have a national carrier and whether or not we support it. I think the more curious thing is why we're having this debate. I mean, Joe Hockey rocks up to from what I understand, a private business lunch and floats this massive debate in a rather strange way. We see the share price of Qantas go upwards. And then we have the Treasurer of the country coming out and saying, oh, let's have a debate. Let's have a debate. And by the way, I don't really have a position. I kind of have a position. And this is kind of choice.
But that's consultation, isn't it?
No,
the Rudd Gillard governments could have done the same.
No, it's not consultation. And it's not really having a debate. And it's not having a position. And we were told the adults are in charge. Well, adults have positions, and if you're an adult and you're treasurer and you want to do something, then you just stump up and say, this is the proposal.
We'll open this up in a moment, but I just want to come to you now, Tony.
And so there's a question of why are we having this debate and how are we having this debate? No real government proposal on the table, and it just left out there, frankly, to commentators and think tanks to sort of throw
We're
it
having a
out.
debate because Qantas put it on the table.
Well, Tony Shelton, let me ask you, you've got more skin in the game here than anyone around the table because you've got a lot of members that are involved and affected by what happens at Qantas. What's your view?
Well, we've got many thousands of workers right across the aviation industry, but equally importantly, we've got a national economic interest about what happens at Qantas, Virgin, Rex, a whole number of aviation services. And the real question is about how we actually get a proper industry operating within the country, because we've seen 8,000 jobs outsourced overseas. We've seen jobs within this country that have been turned to part-time. We've seen Qantas ham-fisted approach to its Jetstar Asian expansion. And we see them asking today for more money in some fashion, when only 3 weeks ago they were putting $60 million of Qantas hard, cold cash into Jetstar Japan. So one of the critical things that Joe Hockey should be addressing, not over a lunch and a few drinks, he should be addressing the fact that where's this money going? Is it for the Australia's interest? If there's any change, is it in Australia's interest for employment, for our economic interests, or is it just money going to be flitted away in Southeast Asia and a failed operation in Jetstar?
Well, Kelly O'Dwyer thinks that industrial relations reform in relation to the airlines is something that could be considered. How's your response to that?
I totally agree with it. And quite clearly, where a company can put 100,000 passengers without any warning to the general public and close it down, lose $200 million the same year as a result of that cavalier approach, very ideologically driven, strand nearly 2,000 children around the world unaccompanied, and say that's just part of doing business, then we have to do reforms. We have a company who can turn around and just last few weeks ago decide that 1,400 employees are now part-time, which gives them $200 a week below the minimum wage, when they can actually give people decent jobs in an aviation industry that can successfully operate in this country. What we're seeing at Qantas, and that is that we're seeing a cross-subsidisation, the sweating of the brand, the sweating of their planes, certainly the sweating of consumers and the workforce, to fund a Southeast Asian expansion of the airline, which is failing. And it's failing to.
But Qantas would argue that Jetstar is their more profitable arm, yet you're saying that that is one of the problems.
Well, there's a lot of commentators that say that Jetstar in Asia and that expansion is a failure, and the $60 million that was put out over to Jetstar Japan just 3 weeks ago is an example of that. But what Qantas is failing to do, and has repeatedly failed to do, and it's not required actually under our accounting principles, what they failed to do was say where the cross-subsidisation goes from Qantas to Jetstar, except 3 weeks ago. So now we've got to foot the bill for the expansion in Japan. Now, that comes back to a question about how the airline's been run, not a question about whether the laws are wrong, because quite clearly we bequeathed 20 years ago a debt-free airline to the private sector under certain conditions. And that's critically important, that they keep their word, keep their honesty to the Australian public, and have a company that is intent is to look after our national interests, as well as profitability. Both are important.
Do we have to face up to the reality that the successful international airlines tend to have large amounts of government ownership? Tim Wilson, I saw a tweet that you did earlier today talking about the idea that you might shift your business to Virgin Blue if taxpayers' funds go into Qantas. But Virgin Blue receives an inordinate amount of taxpayers' funds just from overseas nations. So you would be, if you did that, supporting a taxpayer-funded overseas airline above a taxpayer-funded Australian airline.
Well, first we need to state that Twitter corrected me. It's no longer called Virgin Blue. Apparently it's called Virgin Australia. Yes, that would be true, but except for the fact that that would be foreigners subsidising my travel. If they want to do that, more the power to them. The issue we have is what we have control over in this country. And the question is, do we want to have our taxpayers' dollars going towards supporting an airline which maybe, I don't know all the details around the individual transactions, but maybe Tony's right. Maybe there are serious issues around management within the company. Further evidence about why we shouldn't be then tipping money in subsidies. My big concern is that the management of Qantas and the unions have got together and said they want to focus on getting subsidies because that is the way.
Do you have any evidence of that, or is that just
no? I'm saying that's my concern, and I've heard other people raise that concern as well. That they've done a deal which is to focus on the subsidies because there's simply no basis for Alan Joyce to have discarded completely the investment component and investment liberalisation component as a potential, at least component of the solution for this problem.
Kelly O'Dwyer, I saw you nodding when Tim Wilson said that. You agree that it's odd that Alan Joyce would discard that so quickly?
Well, I haven't heard all his comments, but if that is the case, that he has completely discarded it, then I would agree. You know, I do find that a little bit odd. But just picking up on a point that Tony made earlier about the industrial relations component to do with Qantas, I think the truth is, the agreements that people are on, the legacy agreements that people are on at Qantas are very different to the agreements that people are on with a number of different airlines, including those that are competitors.
Better conditions.
Well, they're different conditions, and I suppose one of the questions for the TWU is whether or not they want to continue to be able to dictate to an airline exactly how they're going to run it. They want to be involved in the management decisions of an airline, and frankly, if that's going to be the operating model, of course, it's not going to be as competitive as other airlines around the world. And I think that's one of the big problems.
Some of the most successful companies in the world, Southwest Airlines is a great example, where they have a very strong partnership between the workforce, their elected representatives and the company.
Partnerships are fine. It's unions dictating to management that I have a problem with.
I think you're really trying to change the subject, because reality is partnerships do work, and what you're suggesting is, and similar to Tim, and that is that anything that smells of the workplace having representatives that can actually speak up on behalf of the workers is somehow wrong.
That's as much a myth as I think you're arguing that the Qantas management representing. The simple fact is,
very clear conclusion as well.
It's the difference between the structures in terms of people's workplaces. Even Jetstar has a different arrangement.
If you're saying that there's an unfairness in the market because of what wages are being paid across the market in the aviation industry, then I'd be the last person to say that, in actual fact, I'd be the first person to agree with you to say that we should actually have a fair rate for the work you do. Whether you work for Virgin, whether you work for Qantas, whether you work for Rex, you should get returns for what you actually do as a performing employee. Have a fair playing field. Because what Qantas argued for, they shut down the airline because they said with 65% of the domestic market that they were unfairly competing with everybody else, because some people, some of which they were actually contracting to, were paying less. So you can't have it both ways. You actually have to say, do we want to have a fair return for the community in the aviation industry? Do we want to have planes flying in the air and not falling into the ground? And what sort of proper regulation do we want to have, rather than just leaving it to market regulation?
But then the TWU took unlawful industrial action, and you were fined as an organisation.
In actual fact, that was 3 years beforehand, and you know what? We did the right thing then, because what happened was the company reneged on deals about permanency within that workforce, and what do we see now? Your nirvana. We see 1,300 employees in the age of 40 and 50 getting 20-hour minimums, which is $200 a week below the minimum wage. And the company has said they can afford to have direct permanent employees, but they won't, because they want to churn and burn. That's their comments, because they want your nirvana, where you can turn around and just tell people what to do rather than have a partnership like Southwest Airlines.
Let's move on to another issue before we go to a break. Nick Champion, let me ask you about China and some of Julie Bishop's comments and the reaction from China. This comes in the wake of what happened with Indonesia. Now, Bill Shorten is saying that we should have a Team Australia approach to these issues, but by the same token, there is criticism that is emerging from sections of the Labor Party in opposition about the job in the foreign affairs space that the coalition are doing. What do you say?
Well, look, I think we want Australia to succeed and have good relationships with our trading partners and with our neighbours, and these are obviously critical relationships. Indonesia, Japan, China, they're all critical relationships. I think there's the question I would have about the government's performance is one, less about their positions and more about how they're communicating them, and the sort of bellicose nature, that they're very, very initially very, very strong. And we saw this in the Parliament with Tony Abbott, very, very strong statement. And then, a few weeks later, we've got a bit of a problem, so they slowly get to a more diplomatic outcome. And I think that might be the issue that's emerging with this government.
So was there a problem with the reaction to China, calling the Chinese ambassador in relation to the dispute with Japan?
Well, time will tell, I think, about that. Time will tell. But it is a very, very emotionally charged dispute between China and Japan. It has a lot of history to it, and I think it's in our national interest to be very, very careful and not inflame the situation. What we need is a situation where this is resolved by rules, by diplomacy, by engagement, rather than unilateral action or reaction to a unilateral action.
Is there a problem, Kelly O'Dwyer, with...
No, there isn't. There isn't a problem. And this is what I find completely bizarre, is that you've got every single different ALP member of parliament out there totally freelancing on our foreign affairs policy. You know, we had Bill Shorten in the parliament say that he was going to be for a Team Australia approach, and you've got people like Tanya Plibersek, who is the opposition spokesperson on this whole matter.
Well, I thought you were in favour of free speech, Kelly.
Saying completely different things to the leader. The truth is, we have to always stand up for Australia's national interest. We have to be very clear.
But are we doing that
We have to strengthen the relationships within our region.
But are we doing that by taking on China on an issue that is so emotive to them?
No. What we have done is we have simply raised concerns that unilateral action...
They haven't done that.
I'm happy to finish.
They haven't done that. In actual fact, there's been an overreaction. There's been an L-plate type approach to this. And what
does that mean? That doesn't mean...
There's been an overreaction to it. I'm no foreign... I'm not going to suggest I'm any foreign affairs expert. It just seems quite clearly that when you overreact, that you get the reaction back.
No,
what's the overreaction?
What's the overreaction?
We're certainly calling the ambassador in, taking that sort of approach. Quite clearly, the sorts of language that was used could have been done in a lot more diplomatic way, but still make the point very clearly. Anyone can see this is a long-term game being played by China, and it could have been done in a more diplomatic way, because quite frankly, whether it be that or other issues that have been happening in the foreign affairs space with Indonesia, for example, that there has been an overreaction about how the government has actually approached both issues. They've stumbled away, stumbled their way through it, stumbled their way through it.
Can I ask a question? Let me ask this question back to you, Kelly O'Dwyer. Why should Australia even get involved at all in something that is a dispute, a regional dispute that doesn't involve us between Japan and China? Why call either ambassador in?
We need to take a strong interest in our region, and we are strong leaders within our region. And I think it's entirely appropriate that our Foreign Affairs Minister, Julie Bishop, was quite appropriate in raising concerns about unilateral action taken by China. Now, unless you actually call in the ambassador to actually raise these concerns with them, you're in fact not putting Australia's national interests first, and you're not playing the appropriate role in the region that we should be playing. Now, the idea that the opposition wants to try and play politics with our foreign affairs and national interest, I think is really quite alarming. And I think it's a demonstration that we were right all along when we said that they were the children and that we were the adults, and we're behaving in exactly that way, and I think so are they.
Tim Wilson, let me ask you, as somebody that is a representative of a free market think tank, should Australia be quite clearly taking the side of a democracy like Japan in a border dispute like this over a non-democracy like China?
Well, I operate in a sort of realpolitik approach to international public policy rather than that sort of liberal internationalist approach which leads you down a very naive path like the former government was engaged with. Absolutely, we should be making appropriate, reasoned, diplomatic engagement on this particular issue, and I don't see any evidence that there is anything other than Julie Bishop doing that. And we do need to make sure that within the structure of the region that we're not just playing sycophant to China or any other country. There are very complex dimensions to our region, particularly with relation to not just the democracies but our allies in the region and their relationship to China, and this is one we are well within our right to make comment on appropriately, diplomatically, as was done in our national interest, because there'll be other times where we need their support for things that happen in much closer proximity to us. And this idea, I'm actually genuinely concerned about the sort of immaturity that's coming out of the government, the opposition, Labor opposition. I know. It was so recent.
You're in government.
I'm not, but Kelly is. But
your friends and allies.
Opposition is taking on this particular issue, and also on Indonesia, where Kelly's right, they are freelancing, and I think China and Indonesia, as much as anything else, are looking at us and testing the new government and seeing how it's behaving. And I think what it's generally been doing is behaving in a very firm and stern manner in the appropriate way for this national interest.
The opposition has made a very considered approach to this matter, and
Bill Shorten has, I agree.
the opposition and the spokesperson has made a very considered approach to this matter. And what's clearly happening, and that is that from all the commentators in the foreign affairs space are saying that it has been badly dealt with at the beginning of the Indonesian matter. And quite clearly, it's incredibly important that we get it back on track. And quite rightly...
But no, I was just putting that. I mean, if you have a spying situation, irrespective of who did it, there are going to be issues with that. I don't think the issue was the immediate handling. The fact that we spied in the first place might actually be done.
We need to take a break, but just final thoughts on this issue from you, Nick Champion.
Well, look, I think we have to be, as I said before, it's more a matter of style as well as substance. And I think that perhaps the government's got the style element of the diplomacy issue wrong.
But you agree with the substance?
Well, I don't substantively have a problem with many of the things expressed in black and white, but I think the way they're going about it does leave you wondering whether or not it's prudent.
So you wouldn't have sent a letter
time will
yesterday?
tell.
I mean, seriously.
We're going to move on from this issue. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about education, which has well and truly been in the news this week. You're watching The Nation.
At Shell, we're working hard to broaden the world's energy mix, supplying natural gas for the generation of electricity with around half the CO2 emissions of coal, producing biofuel made from renewable sugarcane with our partner in Brazil, and here in Australia, finding ways to fuel our future. Let's broaden the world's energy mix. Let's go.
I'm done smooching Mrs. Muggles. I need something back.
I taste that sticky syrup on my lips.
This isn't just a classroom, because it's much more than papers, pens, desks and diagrams. This classroom is really in a classroom. This is science shared. The best teaching the brightest, using brilliant machines to empower local industry to compete on a global scale. Because our most valued resource isn't our technology or even the resource itself, it's our people.
We're boosting Queensland's economy by $32 billion over 10 years, but we're not a bank. We're creating jobs for nearly 12,000 people, but we're not an employment agency. We're QGC. Together, we're doing good things for Queensland.
Authorised R. Millhouse QGC Brisbane.
Looking to retire in 5, 10, 20 years? With 90 years of financial advice experience, Shadforth can help you make it happen. So get your free copy of Pack Away Your Suit to find out how you could retire earlier.
Introducing McDonald's new Real Choices Chicken and Spicy Mayo McWrap. With hand-picked tomatoes, spicy mayo, crispy or grilled 100% Australian chicken wrapped in a warm tortilla. For just $5.95, but you better believe it, good.
Welcome back. You're watching The Nation. I'm Peter Venelson, filling in for David Spears this evening. I'm joined by Kelly O'Dwyer, Tony Sheldon, Tim Wilson and Nick Champion. Before the break, we were talking about international affairs. We're going to move firmly into the space of domestic politics now and domestic public policy, I suppose. Education, a key issue, Kelly O'Dwyer, and the accusations seem to be that there's been an election broken promise here. How do you see it?
There hasn't. the promise that we made before the election, the promise made by the Education Minister, was to provide the same funding envelope that the Labor Party was going to provide over the forward estimates. That's exactly what we're going to do, except we are going to go a little bit further than the Labor Party in that we are going to provide additional funding for those states and territories that we're going to miss out on schools funding.
Let me just help you out with the exact wording before the election of Christopher Pyne. You can vote Liberal or Labor and you'll get exactly the same amount of funding for your school. Now, that was clearly a mistake, wasn't it, to isolate it to individual schools, because since the election, with what he's announced in the last couple of days, both he and the Prime Minister have refused to confirm that individual schools will get the same funding under their same funding envelope, under whatever they rewrite Gonski to be beyond year one.
Well, there were lots of agreements that weren't actually signed. I mean, we were led to believe that there were signed agreements with Victoria, for instance. There was no signed agreement.
But this includes where the signed
Victoria.
agreements are, like New South Wales, for example, and that's why Barry O'Farrell is so upset, because those words, you can vote Liberal or Labor and you'll get exactly the same amount of funding for your school. That was Christopher Pyne's wording, but now the Coalition is saying otherwise. That clearly is a backflip, isn't it?
We're saying that you're going to get the same amount of funding for education, for schools.
But that's not what you said before the election.
Well, you know, lots of things are said, and what we
Lots
clearly
of promises
said.
are given.
No, what we clearly said before the election was that we were going to provide the same quantum of funding that the Labor Party would provide.
So was that just a slip of the tongue by Christopher Pyne?
Over forward estimates. Well, look, you know, you've quoted something that I haven't heard before from Christopher Pyne, but what we clearly committed to before the election, what was clearly in our policy documents before the election, was the fact that we would provide the same amount of funding to, you know, the various different states that the Labor Party was going to provide, and we agreed to do that. That's what we're going to be delivering, but we're not going to leave out. We're not going to leave out WA, Queensland or the Northern Territory. We're going to provide additional funding to them because they were completely left out by Labor when they ripped $1.2 billion out of education.
Tim Wilson, Kelly Dwyer is right that the policy documents talked about the quantum of funding, not the individual schools, but Christopher Pyne rhetorically brought it down to the individual school in an interview that he did. Is this just a simple case of he was freelancing and that's not what the policy was? That happens in interviews, as we know from Julia Gillard with the no carbon tax comment, which was never in a policy document but was clearly there on national television.
Well, the only difference is that my understanding is the federal government never had the capacity to direct the money directly to schools. It goes to the state government who then ends up giving it to schools anyway. So whether it was a slip of the tongue or anything else, my resentment towards this whole debate is that we're still focusing on inputs rather than outputs. And this has been the constant problem in education, whether it's been Liberal or Labor, that the best way to deliver a better outcome for kids and education is just tip more money into a bad system. What we need is comprehensive reform of the education system. And while there may be...
I have to interrupt you though, because the reason that we're focusing on that side of the debate, in fairness, is because of what the Coalition said before the election.
And that's why I'm saying that's exactly where I was going, which is we can discuss the total amount of funding and there may be a broken promise there. The key question is the alternative model that's going to be put up by Christopher Pyne and the standards that are going to be delivered as a consequence of that going to lift the outcomes for kids? Because I don't think any parent in this country would give two hoots if there was slightly less money or slightly more money if it meant their kids got a better education. That's the test, not the money inputs.
Nick Champion, I want to ask you, why did Bill Shorten, as the then Education Minister, allow the bureaucrats to take $1.2 billion out of the funding envelope just ahead of the election?
Look, this is just a nonsense bit of rubbish that's thrown up to cover up what is a very big broken promise, which is the government said one thing before the election, and we're going to find this on a whole lot of things. The Australian people are going to find out, oh, look at the fine print. We said it, but we didn't really mean it. And by the way, we're going to fix up the obstructionist Liberal states who wouldn't sign on to Gonski, and the whole point of getting the state governments to sign up is federal government puts in X, state government puts in X. But that's not what's happened in WA, in Queensland and Northern Territory. They've just got something for nothing. They've just got something for nothing for serving the Liberal Party's political desires and political wishes. And what's going to happen is, slowly but surely, they're going to go back to the old model, which is unfair, which Catherine Greiner, I think, characterised as a huge muddle. That's what they'll go back to, because it serves their interests, which is to funnel, and it's you better believe that the top end of town believe in resources, because they want to funnel resources to the top
Well, you
end.
cut $1.2 billion
that's what they
out
want
of
to do.
education.
They want to funnel.
You can't deny that because it was in the
quite a
pre-election
lot of
fiscal
nonsense.
hour.
Can I
lot of
ask you about that,
nonsense.
Kelly Dwyer?
Yeah.
Because what
Full of
happened
nonsense.
was they had $1.2 billion set aside in case the states that hadn't
they
signed
took
up
it
to
out.
Gonski signed up. Once they didn't and the deadline passed, the bureaucrats then turned around and took that $1.2 billion away because they hadn't signed up. Now, the mistake that the coalition made, however, is that they committed, before that ever happened and before the bureaucrats made that decision, the coalition committed that all states would receive what they would have received under Gonski, whether they signed up or not. Now, that's the coalition's problem for over-promising, isn't it?
Well,
Why
no,
would
we
you
didn't
give them
overpromise.
something for
We promised that we would deliver the same amount of funding over the forward estimates that Labor promised. Now, they ripped out $1.2 billion. That wasn't our decision. Bill Shorten, when he was Education Minister, he actually ripped the money out. Now,
But it
you know,
wasn't his
unfortunately,
This is the greatest
That's simply
What's it? It's not a
untrue.
furphy. Well, it's not a furphy. It actually
and cover
happened.
up your own
I can show it to you in the pre-election.
Let's go back to what Gonski. Let's go back to what Gonski. Tim, having another study and another inquiry into the education system, the Gonski report was hailed by the private sector, by the public sector, by Liberal governments, by Labor governments as a step forward in improving education. We had very clearly a unity ticket, as described by Abbott and others, on the issue of Gonski going ahead. And they decided that because the public was behind it. They decided this makes sense.
Most of the public hadn't read the report.
Wait a sec.
Most of the public don't actually know what's in it.
The public were behind it. The public were behind it and made a decision that this sounds right. So the government went and the opposition went to the election on the basis that Gonski was going ahead. And now to find that it's being portrayed is a broken promise. And quite frankly, when you're saying more money is going to students for kids in schools, and when many of my members send their kids to public schools, and now they're going to get less money under the Abbott formula that's being proposed, or not guaranteed the same money that they went to the election with. That is a broken promise.
Yeah, I was
Well,
going
that's a broken
to say,
promise.
you're making assertions here that are simply...
No, actually, the government's
Focusing on the same fundamental problem, which is you're focusing on inputs, you're not focusing on
I agree with you on...
And that is part of the issue. And this is also one of the issues that Christopher Pyne needs to deal
one at a time.
with the model of what he's proposing as an alternative, is that we shouldn't be having a Canberra-led model for delivery of education services. And what he needs to make sure is we have a system where there is the money that goes to schools that's appropriate to make sure everybody get a good education, but we should not be having a one-size-fits-all model for
and
education.
that's what we've said.
And that's what we've said.
Congratulations on calling it a Canberra-based model. I don't think that Gonski would be described as a Canberra-based bureaucrat, unless you're suggesting that.
No, I'm saying
in actual fact, there was a proposal put up by Gonski who turned around and was supported before the election by both sides of politics.
We were very clear on that.
To go forward and have the Gonski report go forward.
No,
Made
we
it
were
very
clear that we did not
there was
support
no
the command and
contradiction because
control.
you might be the
No,
only
that's not
person in the
true.
country that didn't hear what Christopher Pyne said, because he made it very clear that there was going to be no less funding for schools.
So
and
there's
they were
a
going to go
difference between
ahead.
funding and the difference between
there
the
was going to go
structures and the delivery of education.
and endorsing the structures of Gonski.
No, we never did that.
Nick
No,
Champion.
and can I just clarify this point? It's quite important because we actually never ever condoned this Canberra reach into every single school, which is what was proposed. I'm happy to finish. I'm happy to finish if you'll just give me a chance. But this is what
You just get me infuriated when you're telling the full story.
This is what I'm trying to actually get it out if you'd like. This is what we said before the election. We said that we did not endorse that. What we did endorse was giving parents and principals autonomy to make decisions about getting the right educational outcomes for their students, because they are best placed to actually know that. And I think Tim makes a very good point when he talks about the importance of getting the right outcomes for students.
Parents are very clear. Parents are very clear about wanting to get the best outcome for the kids. But quite frankly,
and so should we.
My members who do 14 hours and having both their parents working cannot spend time going through the accounts and the teaching manuals for that school. Quite clearly, the decision has been made and was supported by the government and by the opposition to have this is a formula that was well
Principals
thought through
need
to
the
turn
ability
around
to talk about their own curriculum, to make decisions about their own staff.
This is the oldest trick in the book, right, which is to have a completely separate debate from the one you're having. We're not having a debate about standards. I'm happy to have that debate, and I probably agree with Tim on a lot of things, particularly on the teaching of English and literacy, that standards should be higher, and we do need to look at the teaching profession. But that's the thing that's happened over Labor and Liberal governments over the last 30 years, and has more to do with
all of the funding,
frankly,
it's gone
it has
down.
more to do with the
Now you're
teaching.
having that other debate,
That's right. But the Gonski debate is a debate about funding. That's what it's a debate about.
And we
didn't hear about command and control and the federation and having this wonderfully diverse system.
I need to make
before
clear,
the
I've
election.
always talked about that. But even then,
what we heard was a unity ticket.
You're talking about
a unity
political
ticket.
argument.
A unity ticket. That's what we heard.
On the
a
quantum
unity ticket.
of funding, and that hasn't
what
changed.
we've got is a broken promise, and it's just as simple as that. And the more you shilly-shally and try and change the debate, the worse you look. Just admit that you've broken the promise.
We haven't.
Just admit that you've changed.
Well, if you haven't, I just need to understand this, because it might not have been in the policy document, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the
Christopher
policy
Pyne,
document is fairly fundamental.
But also,
So
I
is what you say.
assume that Christopher Pyne, as the Shadow Education Minister, what he says counts too. And what he said was that all schools, the same amount of funding for your school.
What we have said, and we have been very
You can
clear on
repeat
this
it as
before the
many
election
times as you
and
want.
after the election, is that the total quantum of funding under Labor and under the Liberal
You can vote
Party
Liberal or Labor
over
and you'll
the
get
forward
exactly the
estimates
same
would
amount of
be exactly
funding
the same.
for your school.
We haven't changed
Kelly,
that.
you could go
That's
out
what
and
I've
tell
said.
us.
That's what everybody else
You
has
could go
said.
out and tell us the sky's red. I'm
incorrect
sure with
quote.
great conviction.
Sorry, let me just-
But it doesn't change the fact that it's blue.
It's clearly an incorrect quote because...
By him or by me?
No, the whole proposition, it's whether it's an accident or a slight or it was deliberately misleading. I doubt it was deliberately misleading.
He never withdrew the comment. He actually let it stand as part of an election promise.
And let's just get this clear, because the money goes to the states and they make the
You're
decision.
sounding like a defender, Tim, not like an independent think tank.
No, what I'm saying is whatever the justification for it's incorrect from the outset, because the state's got the money. The issue is,
And they
the
determine where the
annoying
money
thing
goes.
is this continued discussion about focus on inputs, which is just a cheap political argument between both sides of politics, rather than what the outcomes are for kids.
And also,
why
by
are
the
you
way,
interested in that rather than outcomes for kids? There's more votes in that.
Well, I am.
Catholic schools can
more
determine
votes in that.
Well, I am, but
They
we're
can
asked
set
about
a quantum of
Gonski, which
funding
is a
and they can
funding
choose where
model.
that money goes.
Yeah,
They
but
can
everybody else
choose
does.
that.
Why do you care about funding models rather than outcomes?
One more set of quotes for you, Kelly O'Dwyer. In November, in this very studio, well, he was in Adelaide, but I was here. In November, Christopher Pyne said, quote, "We will maintain the new funding model." This week he said, "I never said I supported the model."
The same quantum of funding. That's what he was getting at
But
when
on
he made
these
that
two,
point.
we will maintain the new school funding model. I never said I supported the model. Does he maintain something he doesn't support?
I think the point that he was making there was about the quantum of funding, and we haven't changed our position on that.
So I think we can say that the quantum of funding is the key thing in the key lines of the Liberal Party. That's what we can say. That's their out clause. But this just should remind everybody about the Abbott government's true character. And you remember what he said, don't trust anything I say, look at the documents. So people better be, next time the government goes into the election on industrial relations or on tax, they better be looking at the fine print.
All right. On that note, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to move on to the polls to start with and ask the question, why has the honeymoon ended, if indeed it has? You're watching The Nation.
This isn't just a hospital, because it's much more than just wards, halls, smocks, scrubs and busy people. It's brilliant machines, reaching beyond these walls, connecting doctors to hardware, to software, anywhere, delivering better patient care wherever those patients are. Because a hospital isn't just in a hospital, it's everywhere.
With Apia's Drive Less, Pay Less discount, Apia customers driving less than 20,000 kilometres a year are saving an average of 22% on their comprehensive car insurance premiums. If you're over 50 and driving less, call us and find out how Apia rewards your experience.
Think about this. The all-new Trax, Holden's new small SUV, comes with a reverse camera with rear park assist and built-in apps like Pandora, putting over 1 million songs at your fingertips. There's Siri Eyes-free technology.
What would you like the email to say?
Plus Bringo navigation to help you find your way. Uncover new tracks from just $24,990 drive away. And for a limited time, you also get a $1,000 gift card. Think Holden.
Not all potting mixes are created equal. Osmocote Multi-Purpose Mix has been developed using over 30 years horticultural experience. Sydney University tests have proven it can make this much difference. Formulated with Osmocote plant food, this potting mix creates strong roots and grows healthy, beautiful plants. It's a complete life support system. Grow like a pro with Osmocote professional potting mixes.
Look, every day we're using more and more energy.
The world needs more energy.
Where's it going to come from?
That's why right here in Australia, Chevron is building one of the biggest natural gas projects in the world. Enough power for a city the size of Singapore for 50 years.
What's it going to do to the planet?
Natural gas is the cleanest conventional fuel there is.
We've got to be smart about this.
It's the smart way to go.
Right now at Target, get 30% off underwear and sleepwear for the whole family, including 30% off Bonds, underwear and socks.
Get more, pay less at Target.
Give more, pay less at Target.
This isn't just a classroom, because it's much more than papers, pens, desks and diagrams. This classroom is really in a classroom. This is science shared. The best teaching the brightest, using brilliant machines to empower local industry to compete on a global scale. Because our most valued resource isn't our technology or even the resource itself, it's our people.
Welcome back. You're watching The Nation, where I'm talking to Liberal member for Higgins, Kelly O'Dwyer, from the Transport Workers Union, Tony Sheldon, from the Institute of Public Affairs, Tim Wilson, and the Labor member for Wakefield, Nick Champion. Now, before the break, we were talking about education. We're going to move to another issue that's domestic, but in relation to, I guess, international factors. The GST, there's been a debate and a discussion developing this week in relation to whether or not we should look at trying to put GST on online items that are purchased that are less than $1,000. Now, this discussion started when Labor was in power. They did some work into it. The ultimate conclusion, I think, or partial conclusion, was that it was too difficult to administer, too costly to administer. Kelly O'Dwyer, let me start with you. Last night, actually, fellow backbencher, Liberal backbencher of yours, Tony Smith, called for this to be done, and it's been discussed today by the likes of Joe Hockey as being something that's going to be looked at. What do you think?
Well, all of the state treasurers have been making a case to the federal treasurer about the GST and the GST threshold. It's about $1,000 at the moment, and the concerns that have been quite rightly raised have been that it is very difficult for business, particularly small business, to compete, particularly when people are importing goods on which they are paying no tax. They have provided examples of the fact that in other countries around the world they have been able to solve this problem, and that one of the ways of doing that is to lower the threshold and actually apply the tax to the goods that actually are coming in. I know that that's something that is being looked at the moment, and again, it's for the state treasurers who actually benefit from the GST to actually make the case and to make sure that it is worth putting the administration cost on in order to collect that tax.
Nick Champion, if it's happened overseas, as Kelly O'Dwyer says, successfully in more than one country, why was David Bradbury, when he was the Assistant Treasurer, unable to find a way to get it done administratively?
Well, I think it comes back to this question, does the administration costs of the tax justify the revenue that you would raise? And I guess that's that'll be a question that's answered, you know, as they work through these things. But online sales are still actually quite small in terms of the overall retail market. We hear a lot about it, but in actual fact, people still, for most of their retail sort of purchases, still go to shops, and that's.
But the trend is going in the other direction.
Look, I don't know about the trend. There's certainly a small loss of market share. I think it's up to about 5% now. And you know, look, I used to come from the Shop Assistants Union, so I've got an emotional disposition to support people at Myers and Coles and places like that. But look, the internet is changing the world. There's no doubt about that, and it's changing consumers.
So you wonder whether you can fight it?
Well, look, I just wonder about this issue of administration costs and how you're going administer the tax for these very basically small purchases versus the money you collect.
It sounds like a version of more red tape, Tim Wilson, more administration.
It does, and I have mixed views on this because I believe that we should have tax neutrality. It shouldn't really matter how you buy something. All goods should broadly be treated equally, but at the same time, of course, I don't want to see a new tax coming into play or being expanded, at least not unless it's part of a broad-based component of tax reform, which is what we actually need to do. But there are different components. There's the retailers who are up in arms saying we need this tax because it's harming our domestic business. Now, that's just a tosh. I mean, there are so many different reasons why retailers are doing badly in this country, from retail tenancy costs to labour costs to the fact they're not providing the goods and services people want. The GST has very little, if no, impact
but it doesn't
on that.
help.
It doesn't help, but it's like, you know, the last little, it's the last straw, but it may, amongst, you know, 1,000 other that have been laid before him. The other part is the state treasurers, and most of them are after extra revenue. That's all they want because they don't actually want to deal with the issues they have in terms of spending and the structures of spending. So to me, this is just a furphy. Everybody's pushing it for vested interests, and in the end, the consumers are going to end up paying, and there's not going to be any significant dividend.
And Tony Sheldon, there's a fair bit of politics in this as well. The week started with Bill Shorten putting a fairly rational case as to why this might need to happen, but then as soon as it was being discussed by the Liberal Party, both at the federal and at the state level, there was a lineup of Labor ministers over the last 24 hours, shadow ministers I should say, who have come out to condemn the move. That's another contradiction between the leader and his troops.
Well, I could say I probably agree with something, unfortunately, with Tim.
You heard it here tonight on your show.
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm about to try to slam you down on something else. But,
let's get back to industrial relations.
Well, which I will. But there is a question about tax neutrality and about how that works. And there is obviously a very important question about, you know, what is the cost benefit of putting the tax there, and at some point there will be a cost benefit. So to me, making sure that we maintain Australian jobs and we have a neutral tax system is critically important. I just can't let go through to the keeper the labour cost issue for shop assistants is, so that's one of the issues holding people back. I know you've glorified Gina Reinhardt just recently in your organisation for, you know, the person who wants to bring pay people $2 a day, $2 a day, and so I know your philosophy is consistent, and that is that people shouldn't really have lots of rights in this country, and somehow that adds cost to everybody by having a right.
If I want to make fictitious arguments up, I'll hand it to you, Tony. The simple fact is we actually believe that people should be able to engage in workplace arrangements which are mutually beneficial to them and to their employers, and that doesn't.
Is that the royal we, or you're talking?
No. That's the IPO, but that's me, and that's any rational, sensible person who's thought about it. The point is that it's part of a range of issues and cost structures that are making it difficult for retailers to compete, including against online purchases when they don't actually have the same level or rate of labour costs. You know that full well. I mean, please
negotiating. You think that parents want their kids to be negotiating with their employer on their wages?
I think we've moved off topic.
I think we've got
I think we've established Tim's position is that people should have the full measures of their liberty everywhere except for their workphilosophical
No, I actually want them in the workplace. That's the one part
in the workplace, they don't have any rights at all.
We've got time left. Let's not psychoanalyse Tim Wilson's philosophical outlook. Let's move on. Let's discuss the polls. It's early on in the life cycle of the Abbott government, very early on, Kelly O'Dwyer, but Weet-Bix might have been spilt nonetheless when, for the first time in a long time, an opinion poll came out at the start of the week showing that the Liberal Party were behind, or the coalition were behind the Labor Party on the two-party vote. What happened?
I'm not a poll expert. I don't know.
But you're a political expert. Well, what happened?
Well, look, polls change, and they go up, they go down. I honestly,
Indonesia, do you think that was a key factor?
Well, I honestly don't know. I'm not a poll expert. I can't explain to you the reasons why people will have provided, their opinions as they have done. All I can say is that we're not going to be distracted by polls. We're not going to be a poll-driven government like the previous government, where they actually got rid of leaders, prime ministers, on the basis of polls. 2 of them, in fact. We are going to simply and effectively and methodically deliver government and good policy, as I think people expect us to do.
Was that done, Tim Wilson, in relation to the handling of the Indonesia situation? It did seem to escalate before it started to level out a little bit when there wasn't a direct line of communication between the Indonesian president and Tony Abbott, but rather there was Tony Abbott talking to the Australian Parliament.
Well, Peter, firstly, I want to go back to your original question, which was about the polling, and I think giving far too much credence to the Fairfax poll. There have been 3 polls this week. I can't believe you're not more loyal to your employer, but that's your choice. There are 3 polls this week, one by...
It would hardly have worked for me to say, Kelly O'Dwyer, a 2-party result of 52-48 in your favour. That must be concerning.
Hang on, but this is the point. There were 3 polls, at least I've seen this week. One was the Fairfax one, which had the Coalition slightly behind, and they had the Essential and the News Limited poll, which basically both showed that the Coalition...
But numbers are down even on the News
course.
poll.
I'm not trying to dispute that. So I think putting too much weight on that would be foolish for a News Limited journalist or an independent observer. The key issue then is to answer your question about Indonesia. Look, there was a lot of colour and light at the early start of the revelations. How much of that was Tony Abbott's fault, I think, was incredibly small, and the government's fault was very small. What's been clear is that since they've actually managed the issue quite successfully, and there's still plenty of stages of this to go. I mean, Greg Sheridan had an excellent column today in The Australian going through the fact that there has been there's good management in the past week, but we can't say there's not going to be more, and that's going to be where the test is going to be. These are early days, and so is that going to contribute to the poll? Yeah, maybe, but there might just be people being distracted by other things or being excited by other things.
Nick Champion?
Well, look, I think this is the beginning of people working out what this government's like, and they're an opposition that promised everything to everybody. So if you were out bush with Barnaby, he was against foreign investment. But if you're in a boardroom with Joe Hockey, he was for it. And now they're being found out. And that the process of government will soon, I think, rip and tear away at some of the contradictions that are just inherent in this government.
Well, you
see it on education, you see it in foreign investment.
Well, you raised Barnaby Joyce and you raised Joe Hockey, which raises a nice final topic to discuss before we run out of time, which is, of course, GrainCorp. Now, Kelly O'Dwyer, what would you like Joe Hockey to do on GrainCorp?
I don't think that Joe Hockey needs any advice from me directly via your cameras.
What about Barnaby?
What do you think Barnaby would like to see done on GrainCorp?
Well, look, I suspect Barnaby's made his position quite clear, as has Warren Truss, and Joe has also equally made it very clear that he's actually going to look at the information on the table, the recommendations from the Foreign Investment Review Board. We take foreign investment very seriously in our country. We need it in order to grow businesses.
But one of the great things about our parliamentary system and the tradition of the Westminster system is that backbenchers are free to offer views unrestricted by the restrictions of the front bench. So your personal view on GrainCorp?
Well, look, I have written very extensively on foreign investment. I think you would need very serious reasons to actually knock back a foreign investor in a situation such as this. And, you know, frankly, I can't see the case for that. Now, I'm not privy to all of the information that's been provided, but I would find it, you know, very interesting if in fact it was a case which was knocked back by the Foreign Investment Review Board.
Can I ask you, Tony Sheldon, Paul Howes came out on an Australian agenda in favour of GrainCorp being allowed to be sold to the US company. Did that surprise you to see a union official in favour of a foreign ownership sale like that?
Paul has a lot of views on lots of issues, but also he has a very strong view about that sector, which he has a close relationship with. He's obviously he's very active in that area. But I think there's a really critical question, and that is that what is in the national interest in this? And you know, I may well come to the conclusion that it's not the national interest as well to actually have foreign investment in there, but. What certainly many people...
You and Barnaby in lockstep.
Well, maybe I am. One of the things that Barnaby's and others, certainly the community in the bush, is rightly concerned about, and that is that what does this mean for national food security? How is that going to be addressed? That just letting it saying that the answer is the market should be allowed to operate is ridiculous.
No. The question is it can't be solved by the foreign investment question. I mean, all these other issues that people try and sort of wrap into the question around foreign investment, around land use, around what our taxation system should be.
But as your colleagues wrap in these issues...
No, I'm saying the broader commentary, right? The broader commentary on this. I think we have to separate out the issues because we need the right policy framework in place. And all of those issues actually get sorted out by having the right policy framework in place. The separate question as to who owns a particular company is, I think, a very separate issue, and you can't confuse those two issues together.
Tim Wilson, the Liberal Party and the Coalition indeed, should it be paying substantial attention when effectively in unison almost all members of the National Party, rural representatives as well as rural Liberal representatives, have a problem with GrainCorp being sold to the United States company? when that's the case, even though the city dwellers of the Liberal Party dominate, is that pause for thought?
Well, of course, it's pause for thought for a political party in making these decisions and, of course, by a government, but there's no ambiguity about where my position lies. I mean, I actually agree with the sort of rational, intelligent position that, for instance, Joel Fitzgibbon put out there about foreign investment on an episode of Q&A where he talked about the fact that just because somebody owns something, whether it be land or whether it be an investment that happens to be attached to a foreign company or a foreign investor, which even is a state-owned enterprise, we maintain sovereign right to implement laws over assets in our country, and if necessary to repatriate them or nationalise them if they're being abused or misused with appropriate compensation, so we're not stealing people's property rights. We're entirely reasonable to let it go through, and it's very sensible to do so.
We're almost out of time. Where do you sit on this, Nick Champion?
Well, generally speaking, I think foreign ownership or foreign investment is a desirable thing, but I think in the longer term we want to be a nation of savers rather than lenders or borrowers, lenders rather than borrowers. And I think the big concern about this for farmers is that these used to be, in essence, state-owned monopolies, that they, the silos or the infrastructure, and now they've become private monopolies in many instances. And I noticed that
You want to nationalise?
Well, no, I don't. But I noticed that the Queensland Premier, for instance, says, well, they should have to divest the ports. And so I do think there are some interesting competition questions, but they are separate from the foreign investment decision.
There is a risk, Kelly O'Dwyer, that if the conditions are too onerous, then the US company would pull out. Would that be a loss for foreign investment in this country?
Well, look, I don't want to get into lots of hypotheticals around this specific question because it is on foot and it's going to be decided by the 17th of December. Treasurers have over time put appropriate conditions on foreign investment approvals. I can't see that that's going to change with this current Treasurer. I think there will be times where he might wish to impose conditions, and then it's a matter of whether or not the company accepts the conditions that are imposed.
All right, we are right out of time. Kelly O'Dwyer representing the Liberal Party, Tony Sheldon from the Transport Workers Union, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs, and Nick Champion, Labor member for Wakefield. Thank you one and all for your company, and thanks very much for your company as well. David Speers will be back in the chair next week. I'll see you tomorrow for Contrarians.